Now, this is something I really want to talk about to ensure everyone stays cautious and level-headed at all times. For context, I lived in the middle of nowhere in Canada. It was an old town with quite a few abandoned buildings due to a lack of residents. My friends and I were tired of the lack of entertainment options, so we explored these abandoned buildings. Before the experience I'm about to share, nothing too crazy had ever happened to us. Occasionally, we would see a small amount of blood-like liquid, and once we saw a pentagram on the ground left by someone who had been in a house before us, but nothing too alarming. That all changed the last time I went exploring abandoned buildings. When I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part of a mental hospital. Weird combination, I know. It shut down due to a lack of patients and not enough children attending the daycare. A few years ago, I decided to return there with my friends. For context, I was 15 at the time and most of my friends were around the same age. When we arrived, the scene was like something out of a movie. There was a fog, it was dark, and there was a light drizzle of rain. We reached the main gate, which was padlocked shut. We helped each other climb over it, making a lot of noise as we laughed and joked, unaware of what was coming. We shone our flashlights around the small play area and park. Despite having decent flashlights, our visibility was limited. We decided to go into the decaying building. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section. There were old Lego pieces, wood chips from broken furniture, and torn dolls and toys scattered around. The deeper we went, the more silent we became until all we could hear was the crunch of dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room and walked over to pick them up. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door that led to the psych ward part of the building. We all looked at each other. There were 5 of us, and most of my friends were bold and cocky. My friend Brian suggested we check it out. Personally, I wasn't fond of the idea, but with my friends, declining wasn't an option. We gathered at the door and tried to open it. It was rusted to the floor and we had to heave to get it open. The metallic smell and must became stronger as we entered, mixed with another scent I couldn't identify at the time. Brian led the group and we shone our flashlights in all directions. The hallway was narrow with metal doorways on either side, some open. I felt slightly claustrophobic and found it hard to breathe. Brian shone his flashlight into a room and suddenly recoiled. We all stopped. "What is it?" I asked. "I thought I saw someone, but it's fine now." He sounded uncertain. At the time, I thought he was just trying to scare us, but looking back, I think he was serious. We continued walking deeper into the psych ward. Another friend quickly told us to stop. We stood still and listened. In the distance, we could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway. We exchanged nervous glances, fear clear in everyone's eyes. Brian pressed forward toward the sounds. For a moment, we thought about turning back without him, wondering if some ghost or creature was in the building, but we couldn't abandon him. The further we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. Finally, we entered a room on the right that smelled like rotting meat. In front of us was a dead deer, its innards spilled all over the floor and staining the concrete. One of my friends, who had a weak stomach, vomited. That's when we heard whispering. Brian shone his flashlight into a corner, and we saw a man standing with his head down. He had short hair, a bright green t-shirt stained with what looked like blood, and torn beige pants. He had no socks and his feet were damaged. He twitched sporadically and continued to mumble even after we noticed him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he moved. He looked up with a haunting grin that sent shivers down our spines. "You guys here for the feast?" he said, each word varying in inflection and energy. That was enough to push us over the edge. We bolted out of the room and ran back to the daycare center. The door was still open and we tried to slam it shut, but it was heavy and rusted. It took 3 of us pulling with all our strength to close it. Just before it shut, I saw the silhouette of the man watching us, his white teeth the only feature visible. We sat behind the metal door, catching our breath and confirming with each other that we had all seen the same thing. After a moment of labored breathing, we heard a light tapping on the door. That was when we decided it was time to leave. We ran out of the building and didn't stop until we got home. A year later, the police conducted a routine search of the area and found the man. He had been a patient at the psych ward before it closed and had escaped from the facility he was transferred to. He survived by eating the wildlife around the complex. When the cops caught him, he was suffering from several diseases and conditions from eating raw meat. His mental state had deteriorated further. There were rumors that he had killed someone in the forest while looking for food, but nothing was confirmed. In the end, be careful, especially in dangerous places like abandoned buildings. And to the creepy man, let's not meet again. This is truly the scariest and most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still do not know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he is still where I saw him. I apologize for the length of the geographical description, but I want everyone to understand just how secluded I was when this happened, and how badly it could have ended if it had not been for my parents. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting university. Our home is just outside of a small town surrounded by forests. There was also a small man-made lake, diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest, and split into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home there was a narrow grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I often took as a child. I knew the forest well and knew where to cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The path I followed always led me off the main trail, which gradually turned northwest away from the stream, and then sharply turned west after several miles. At that point, the stream would be hidden deep in the forest. I would continue walking north, following the stream through the trees to reach the river, and then follow the river west to get to the lake. It was easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain was uneven, rising and falling, leaving you surrounded by dense trees. I had spent many days wandering there alone or with my dad over 18 years, and had never seen another person in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone, sort of. The first time I left in the morning and walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after about an hour. While running my hands in the water, I heard a bell ringing from far away coming from the north. It rang fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened carefully and wondered if it was a lost hunting dog. I started moving toward the sound, thinking, yeah, I know I'd be the first to die in a horror movie, but I was heading north anyway, so what's the harm? I realized it couldn't have been an animal. The bell sounded too heavy to be attached to a collar due to how clear and resonant it was. I kept moving, but the bell started moving away from me and then stopped completely after about 5 minutes. The stream wasn't large or powerful enough to carry an object like a bell enclosed in a tin or something, and the river was still too far. I considered every possibility, but nothing explained the sound except the obvious conclusion. It had to be a person. That thought made me uncomfortable. so I pushed it out of my mind and continued walking as usual. Then I found a badger, a dead one, carefully decapitated. It had clearly been done with a knife. The body was fairly fresh. It was still limp and didn't have a smell yet. The wound was crawling with maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The bell sound had been following the stream just as I had. That meant the badger was likely put there, possibly killed and definitely decapitated, while I was walking in that direction. I wasn't sure, but the thought disturbed me. Nothing else happened that day. A week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 o'clock in the evening. I made it to the stream and then walked to the river in about an hour. Because it was getting late and starting to rain heavily, I decided to head back the way I came. The sun set at around 9 o'clock. I walked as fast as I could, the sound of rain on the trees loud and surreal. I was trotting with my head down through the clearest, most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickening. It was the decomposing body of the badger, with its head tied to its front paws. The way it was bound made that area look like a ham, and it swung from a tree like an obscene, putrid display. Green liquid dripped from it and the stench was unbearable. I started gagging as mucus-like fluid dripped onto my hair. It was repulsive. At first, I just stared at it in shock. Then I began to fidget uncontrollably, feeling as though I was drenched in the creature's juices. I was already soaked from the rain and my senses were overwhelmed and confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I had walked the same path to get to the river. Someone had strung up the body after I had passed it on my way there. Someone knew I would see it. So, was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream, heading back toward the path when I heard the bell again. I called my dad while running and told him to meet me at the part of the path where it sharply turned west. It was the closest point to me, and I urged him to get there as fast as possible, explaining that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was as if I had just emptied my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck stand up even though I was soaked. It was dark, and I jogged as fast as I could. Panic set in because the path was still a bit too far away to feel safe. The rain was still falling and every sound was muffled. It felt as if everything was further away than ever before. The bell rang much longer this time, on and off, and at one point it felt like it was surrounding me. The fear, combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't breathe properly, made me lose my sense of direction slightly. I was heading southwest automatically, but I wasn't sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a horse, coughing and wheezing, almost crying out loud like a toddler. I tripped over leaves and twigs, trying to stay on the phone with my mom who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds but couldn't tell what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone, telling me they were on the path and that I needed to run. She said my dad had gotten out and he was heading east from the path bend. Terrified, I went into survival mode, half running and half speed walking because I was out of breath. Then I heard branches breaking and, for the first time, distinct footsteps coming from deeper in the forest. The bell was ringing louder. Against my better judgment, I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw him, a tall figure creeping in my direction at the edge of the clearing, ringing the bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. I don't know if I had some hidden sprinting ability or if adrenaline gave me superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I didn't look back once. I screamed as loudly as I could. I lied, shouting, "I'm on the phone with the police and they're on the path. And Dad, I can see you, I'm here." I wanted to scream, "Dad, please, where are you?" but kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was about to happen and that the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. Gasping, wheezing, and crying, I screamed for my dad. I felt shivers running up my neck before my mind switched off, and my body took over. I just ran. I even dropped my bag, only realizing I didn't have it when I was in the car. My phone felt like my only lifeline. Reality began to blur as my legs moved on their own. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart pounding in my ears and the bell. Finally, I heard my dad shouting my name. The intonation of his voice told me he could see me. I lunged at him as soon as we reached each other. My dad had heard the bell too, and my mom still on the phone and could hear it in the background. She was waiting with the car ready to leave as fast as possible. I grew up in the wooded country of Illinois, on a short dead-end street more than 10 miles from the nearest town. There were 7 houses spread out over large 2.5-acre wooded lots or larger. There were no large wild animals like bears in the area, and people rarely passed by. In fact, during the 20 years I lived there, I never encountered any lost travelers or large animals wandering around. When I was a young girl in my early teens, I had a good friend named Terry who lived next door. He was a few years older than me. Terry was allowed to stay out later than I was, and sometimes after he got home late, he'd throw rocks from the gravel area outside at my window to chat. My bed was right next to the window. I would open it and we'd whisper stories and talk for a bit. My second-story window faced our backyard, and his house was to the side. I could see it over the shrub trees and walking path leading to his driveway. I often knew if he was out, the light would be on by the side door, or if he was home, the light would be off. One summer night, I had my window open when I heard a car pulling into Terry's driveway. I was probably 14 years old, and it was around midnight. I heard Terry getting out of the car and talking to his friends. Soon they drove away. I softly called out as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. But he didn't respond. He probably didn't hear me. So I came up with the not-so-brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I had spent years in the woods learning how to blend in and be silent. As kids, we often snuck around to scare each other. I silently crept down from the second floor out the back garage door and into the yard below my window. Terry's house was just off to the side, through the gravel area and a well-worn path through the woods about 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit behind the house, probably because nothing grew due to the shade from the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds laid down unevenly like stepping stones in the gravel, and stepping off them would give me away with the crunch of gravel. I carefully crossed the log rounds facing Terry's house. My eyes adjusted to the dark, but I didn't see him. I heard the door to his house close and the light turned off, signaling that he had gone inside, likely to bed. I waited for a while and thought I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path. If someone didn't use the path, they'd have to walk through the wild rose and raspberry bushes with painful thorns. So I thought it was strange that Terry would be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I had planned to do to him. I saw something human-sized and dark moving slowly through the woods, pausing every once in a while like me. It was coming closer. I could definitely see it, but it was strange. It wasn't walking toward my window to talk. I hunched down and waited in silence. thinking I could still startle him. I thought it was Terry, maybe trying to scare me because he saw me sneak out. The figure moved slowly, but I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking, checking every few feet, hiding behind trees. After waiting for a bit, I whispered one last time, but Terry didn't answer. I grew bored of hiding and quietly tiptoed back to my garage door, slipping inside and locking it behind me. I snuck back upstairs to my room above the area where I had just been standing. My window was still open and I heard someone walking around the yard below. I whispered for Terry out the window again, but he didn't respond. Then I heard a loud grunt and the sound of something falling into the window well beneath my window. It was loud enough to send a shock of fear through me, but not loud enough to wake my parents. If you're not familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole about 3 or 4 feet deep, reinforced with metal, to allow natural light into a basement window below ground level. There was no way Terry could have fallen into our window well. We had been playing games like hide and seek around the neighborhood for years, and we knew the locations of everyone's window wells and the paths through the woods like the back of our hands. The sound was definitely human, not like an animal, and I could hear whatever it was quietly pull itself out without thrashing around. That's when I realized this wasn't a game. Someone or something was out there, and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside, but the window screen blocked my view, so I couldn't lean out far enough to see next to the wall of our house. Then I heard the crunch of rocks as whatever it was stepped on the gravel. Terry would have known to avoid the gravel, and he would never step on it because he was as quiet as I was. I held my breath, waiting. I probably stayed there face pressed against the screen for about half an hour, though it felt much longer. I never heard it leave, but I eventually grew tired and fell asleep on my bed next to the window. There are a few things I'm certain of. It wasn't Terry. I asked him later and he said he had gone to bed that night when he got home. He also had no reason to lie. I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of our neighbors. We had only 2 other houses with kids and those houses were far apart. There were no large animals in the area. We did have deer, but they were hunted and stayed away from the houses. Our dog also scared them off. Stranger in the woods, let's never meet. I've told this story to my roommates, who are from the same town, and I've talked about it a few times with people who were there, but that's about it. I don't like to talk about it much because, inevitably, someone always says, "Really, we should go try and find it again," and I really don't want to. I've looked for it on a map a few times, but I can't find it. Though my male friend who drove there that night swears he has the directions memorized, through Google's aerial maps. Anyway, I'm originally from a major city in southern Ohio. Outside the city, there are several smaller townships. One of these is known as the more country bumpkin redneck or grit part of town. It's not even in the same county, but it's still part of the general area my city is in. In the woods, there's a legend of Hell's Church, supposedly an old church that burned down where Satanists now perform rituals, or a satanic church that burned down due to a ritual, depending on who you ask. There are a number of Hell's Church myths in Ohio in different places, but this one was closest to us. Some of my guy friends decided they wanted to be ghost hunters and check out haunted places around where we lived. We were juniors in high school, and while we all obviously thought it was just stupid, we found it funny to go out and scare ourselves. Plus, most of us had cars or driver's licenses by now, so we were enjoying the newfound freedom. I'm a scaredy cat about most stuff like this, but I was the most tomboyish girl in the group. I always kind of wanted to hang with the guys, and some of the girls in the group who I was closer to were going, so I didn't want to look like a loser or a scaredy cat. So one night in November, we decided to go out and try to find this church. We had actually been to this location once before that fall, but one of my friends had a curfew, so after exploring an old barn and railroad tracks on a bridge nearby, we left. We hadn't found the church, supposedly just a chimney at this point, to our disappointment and my mild relief. We took 2 cars out there, heading past more populated parts of our city to this wooded area. I can't honestly tell you how we got there, but I know it's off a state highway, then an abandoned access road past some old warehouse, and down a dirt road. Once you're on the dirt road, there's a thicker part early on where we parked the cars off to the side. We did this because the road thins out and becomes impossible to drive down. And also, someone clearly owns the land. Later down the road, there's a no trespassing sign. I'm sure a lot of kids come here, so it didn't seem odd to me that they'd want to block the place off. At the time, I barely thought twice about it. We got out of the cars and started walking down the dirt road, wandering off the path sometimes to check out barns or clearings where we thought the chimney might be. At first, it was just scary because it was dark and old, but then the barns started getting weirder. They were filled with strange spray-painted symbols and nonsense, but that wasn't what bothered us. We figured whoever was there before us did it, which I still 100% believe. What bothered us more were the dead owls, which looked like they had been opened up, though they were dried out and decomposed by the time we got there, thank goodness, and other animal remains. I was grossed out, but we all kind of agreed that these probably came from the same teenagers trying to fake a satanic ritual. Or maybe the animals had gotten trapped in the fallen apart barn and died there, to be picked apart by other animals. My friends were now hardcore trying to find this stupid chimney, so they kept heading through the trees into clearings. The other 2 girls and I stayed back by the tree line for most of it, getting a little more nervous and a little irritated by the lack of success. As we continued, we found a bike by the tree line, a small one, like something a 12-year-old might ride. That was a little creepy, but fine, whatever. Probably belonged to someone who owned the land. We decided to go a little further, and soon enough we found another bike. This one was older, a little rusted, but still too small. We didn't talk too much about the bike, muttering that it was probably still nothing. 1 or 2 of the guys tried to make it sound sinister, saying, "These kids probably got murdered," or something like that, but no one really bought into it. At this point, we'd been out there for about 2 hours, and it was getting really late. Plus, I think we were all a little more creeped out than we wanted to admit. We decided to head back to the cars, and I was feeling relieved, happy to be heading back to my house and out of there. But things never work out that way, do they? By the cars, we saw a road that went straight up a hill through the trees. At the start of it, there was a big metal gate with a road closed sign, which we had seen before, but for some reason it had never occurred to us to try going up the road. We debated at the gate, with an even split between those who wanted to venture up and those who didn't. I absolutely didn't, but eventually we decided to go up just to see. Both of the drivers wanted to go, so there wasn't much we could do about it. We climbed over the gate and started up the hill where an old paved road was cracked and crumbled under our feet. It was clearly once a real asphalt road, but now it was in poor condition. In addition to the road being broken up, there were a bunch of trees that had been felled across the path, purposely blocking it from any cars. Some of us were seriously questioning if we should be doing this, arguing that someone obviously didn't want us there. but we were teased for being afraid and decided to keep going. I couldn't see where the road would end because it was so dark. We had a few flashlights, but they weren't helping much, and the trees made it hard to see. The road was also super steep, so all we could really see was up with only a little moonlight peeking through the trees. All of a sudden, though, we reached the end. The trees opened up and we had come off the incline to a flat field. And holy cow, what a sight it was. The flat field had tall prairie grass on either side, probably 2 or 3 feet high and pretty uniform. The path we were on split the large clearing down the center, leading through the grass to a cul-de-sac with 3 buildings. 2 looked like farmhouses and there was 1 barn-like building. They were made of wood, and while they may have been painted at one point, they mostly looked weathered and stripped by time. I saw this and I was done. I wanted to leave, but, of course, some of my friends said we had to check out the buildings. At this point, I finally put my foot down, as did the other 2 girls and one of our guy friends who decided this was enough for him. He was our valedictorian, so maybe he was just smarter. So, the 3 guys who wanted to go to the buildings told us to just wait there. While we didn't want to be in this field out in the open, we decided we couldn't just leave them. At this point, we turned off our flashlights because the moonlight was so strong. The 3 of them took off down the little path and the 4 of us who remained stayed together, complaining about how stupid our friends were and making small talk. None of us said it, but we were all looking toward the grass every now and then, worried something might jump out. It was just so creepy, this abandoned little settlement. It felt like our friends were gone forever. We saw them get to a building and go inside. It was unlocked, I guess. We could see the flicker of their flashlight lights in the windows, and I remember feeling so tense. It was like watching a horror movie in real life. After maybe 10 minutes, though it could have been just a tense 5, we saw our guy friends coming toward us, lightly jogging, looking afraid for the first time all night. "You idiots went inside," I said, pissed off at them. One of my friends just looked at us, and I'll never forget it. It was full of bikes, just bikes chained to the walls. We didn't believe them at first, waiting for them to say they were kidding, but they insisted. They said it was like they were just storing a bunch of bikes there, most of them smaller. They looked afraid, and as much as I didn't want to believe them, I did. They weren't the type of guys to pull a prank for this long. By then, we all agreed we needed to get the heck out of there, so we started down the hill, hurrying as best we could. All of a sudden, about halfway down the field, we saw a car's headlights near the bottom of the hill, about where our cars were. We saw them pass slowly and we knew someone was down there looking for us. Since it was so far off the beaten path, we figured it was one of 2 things: the cops, and we were going to be in trouble for trespassing, or the people who owned the land or these houses, and they were either going to A, call the cops, or B, murder us. We knew the road wasn't that long, so they'd be turning around, circling back soon enough, and since our cars were there, they'd probably wait for us. We were all whispering about this as we picked up the pace, sprinting down the hill as fast as we could. I'm not a good runner, but I was hauling butt, getting down as fast as I could, practically hurtling over the fallen trees. Once we reached the bottom of the hill, we didn't see any headlights, but we knew they couldn't be far away. "Get in the damn cars," one of our friends yelled, and we fumbled with the doors like in a horror movie, just too nervous to get into the cars. We got in, and just as we started the cars up, we saw the headlights speeding down the road, a giant black truck roaring up behind us. The truck seemed larger than life, raised up off the ground. The whole thing was terrifying. But what was extra terrifying was that we couldn't see who was driving in the dark with the headlights blinding us. We peeled out of there, putting the pedal to the metal. This truck was still following us, getting closer, almost like it was trying to run us off the road. We were all screaming, looking back at the truck, trying to get away. Once we reached the highway, we switched lanes, trying to escape. Luckily, we were in sedans, so it was easier for us to weave in and out of cars. But the truck was still chasing us. We were in 2 different lanes, but didn't want to get too separated from our friends. The passengers in both cars were texting back and forth, trying to make a plan. It took us about 15 minutes to lose the truck. I'm not sure if the distance was too much for them or if they turned around, but once we got to a big shopping center area, we ducked off the road into a Sonic parking lot. We sat in our cars for a while, watching to make sure we wouldn't get snuck up on before getting out to grab food and talk. Everyone, even the guys who had tried to act tough the whole time, was pretty shaken up. It took us a while to settle down enough to head home. As much as we talked it over, we just couldn't figure out what had happened. Eventually, we all went home during what was a pretty silent car ride, exhaustion and lingering fear taking over. We didn't talk about it again for a long time, and we never called the police, which honestly, as an adult now, I feel like we should have. I don't think about it often, only during the fall, really. But when I do think about it, I ask myself, who chased us? Why was that town abandoned? Who owned those bikes, and where are they now? Edit a year later. This post is archived now, so I can't comment on it, but I think I may have a lead on this, so I figured I would post that. Someone messaged me with their guess on the location, and while I don't think it was correct, I searched a little for Hell's Church on a haunted Ohio site and reread the part of it being by an exit ramp for Route 32 in Batavia. My guess is that we may have turned near JCM Equipment Management, and then taken either Ross or Lookout Drive into the woods. The only thing is, I can't make out a clearing in the woods, though between Ross and Rosebush, there does seem to be a building or two. Still trying to find it from time to time. I'm still on the case. When I was 14, I was asked to babysit my 3 younger cousins, aged 8, 4, and 1, in an extremely rural and mountainous part of Pennsylvania. My aunt and uncle had a wedding to attend over an hour away, and wouldn't be back until very late. Their house was on a steep mountainside, with their back deck having a 15-foot drop onto a rocky hill that led down to a river. Their nearest neighbors were about a half-mile away. The closest main road was a mile away, and at night there were no lights to be seen around. Essentially, it was in the middle of nowhere, and you had to know exactly where you were going to find it. You wouldn't just accidentally end up there. My aunt and uncle left us some pizza and their cell phone number next to the landline. This was the early 2000s, and I didn't have a cell phone. But even if I did, I wouldn't get reception there anyway, and headed out. The baby was already asleep. The 4-year-old wasn't feeling well and was quietly watching TV in the living room as he dozed off. And the 8-year-old was playing Guitar Hero with me up on the loft. The loft overlooked the living room to the left, where I could keep an eye on the 4-year-old, and there was a large window that overlooked the driveway to the right. This description of the driveway is an important detail to the story. The road that led to their house ran straight into their forked driveway. It was a dead-end road, with the house being as far as you could go. If you went left, you would reach a large open carport where my aunt and uncle and anyone who ever visited parked. The right driveway led down a very short but steep hill to a large leveled area and ended against the garage door that opened to the basement of the house. This area wasn't used as a garage, but served as my uncle's man cave, where he spent most of his time. Right beside the garage door was a normal door with a window, so you could see right inside. This driveway was exclusively used by the kids as a play area because it was the only flat space on the property. Being on a mountainside, there wasn't much room to safely play otherwise. No cars ever drove down there as there were too many toys and bikes in the way, and friends and family knew this. It was about 10 p.m., pitch black outside, and there was no moon to light the area. My cousin and I were still playing Guitar Hero when headlights caught the corner of my eye. These weren't my aunt's minivan headlights. They were huge truck headlights with those roof lights you often see on Jeeps or other off-road trucks. Not only that, the truck was going down the right driveway, the kids' play area. This was not my aunt and uncle, and it wasn't anyone they knew. Panic and dread filled me. I was a small teenage girl, alone in an isolated house on a mountain at night with 3 children in my care. In a terrified voice, I asked my cousin, "Who was that? Jake, do you know whose truck that is?" He looked panicked too. "No, I've never seen that truck before," he replied. I quickly ushered him downstairs, still unsure of what to do. But the 2 little ones were sleeping down there and I wanted to make sure they were safe. I checked on the baby and grabbed the phone to call 911. Then I started to hear the metal garage door being shaken violently. No one ever opened that garage door. More panic filled me. I heard them try the door beside it, the metal doorknob jiggling. No one was knocking. They weren't trying to see if my uncle was there. The lights were out. It was dark down there. They knew no one was there. They were definitely breaking in. The door leading to the basement steps was right next to the phone, so I could clearly hear everything. I quickly turned the little lock on the doorknob just in case they made it inside. My heart was practically jumping out of my chest. I was talking to the 911 dispatcher as my 8-year-old cousin clung to my arm. The operator was calm and trying to reassure me, but I knew it would be at least 30 minutes before a police officer could get up there, assuming they didn't get completely lost on the mountainside in the dark. I just kept thinking, we are doomed, we are dead. This is how I die. The operator asked for the number my aunt and uncle had left me so she could have another dispatcher call them to let them know what was happening. I turned around to grab the paper with the number on it, and to my absolute horror, I saw a man peering through the large sliding glass door. A huge, burly man who had to have been about 6 foot 4 inches tall, with long, scraggly red hair and a big, bushy red beard. What made it even worse was that he was grinning at me, grinning in a way that still scares me to this day. Meanwhile, I must have looked like a terrified deer in the headlights. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. There was a second man behind him, but I couldn't see him clearly. I have no idea what he looked like, but he was just as tall, though a bit more lanky than the larger man at the sliding glass door. I screamed, "Oh God, they're here!" And before the 911 operator could say anything, my 8-year-old cousin said, "Mr. Jim." His voice was very confused. It wasn't like my cousin was happy or even relieved to see him. I asked, "You know who that is?" But before my cousin could answer, I turned my attention back to the man at the door. "I'm on the phone with the police," I shouted. I'm grateful he didn't try that door because I don't think it was locked. The man stared at me hard for a moment, his eyebrows furrowed as if deciding what to do next. But then he just backed away into the darkness. What seemed like an eternity later, I saw the truck lights back out of the driveway and then head back down the road until they disappeared. I was still terrified, and so was my cousin. He had only met that guy a few times, an acquaintance of his dad. It wasn't like he was a close family friend. and obviously he went down the wrong driveway. Visitors never go down that way. The 911 operator asked for a description of the man, then told me they had gotten in touch with my aunt and uncle, and they were on their way home. She stayed on the phone with me until a police officer showed up a little while later to make sure the men were gone. The officer stayed with us until my aunt and uncle arrived so they could ask them some questions. My uncle was furious, not at me for calling them home early, but at this Mr. Jim guy. He muttered something like, "I'm going to mess him up." My aunt was mad at my uncle and told him to tell Jim to never come back again. I didn't know at the time, but my uncle had a drug problem. I don't know what Mr. Jim or his accomplice were doing, or what they would have done if I hadn't been on the phone with the police. But that grin was not friendly. It was sinister. And again, he had to have known my uncle wasn't there because the basement was dark. He would have seen through the windowed basement door. He had also tried lifting the garage door, something not even my uncle did. He intended to break into the basement. There's no other explanation. I never babysat for them again. And I don't think I ever even went back up there because not long after, my aunt divorced my uncle and moved out. So Mr. Jim, the grinning, burly mountain man who tried to break into the house where I was babysitting, let's not meet again. This happened about a year ago when I was 26. I'm a female and tend to be friendly to most people. I'm not a tiny woman, 5'7" tall and heavier, but I still get quite a lot of attention for some reason. On this particular day, I was headed home from work. I worked in a warehouse at the time, and I was wearing old yoga pants and an old bleach-stained shirt, no makeup, and my hair up. It's summer in South Carolina, and it's hot. I basically looked as unattractive as I possibly could. I had just moved into a new apartment and was planning to build myself some shelves out of wood and cinder blocks. I decided to swing by Lowe's after work to get the materials I needed. I grabbed one of those large pallet carts and started collecting the things I needed. I'm strong and pride myself on being able to build things, lift things, and generally just do stuff on my own. As I was putting cinder blocks on my cart, a Lowe's employee walked up to me. I smiled politely at him. He was maybe 5'11" tall with wireframe glasses, a sparse mustache, yellowing teeth, balding but fit. Probably in his 40s, although I'm a bad judge of age. He offered to help. "No thanks, I've got this," I said. He smiled widely and said, "Oh no, it's okay, this is what I'm paid to do." Then he literally took the cart from me and started pushing it. He began asking me a bunch of questions which seemed pretty standard at first. "What are you building? What do you need?" I answered but kept my responses short. I was definitely getting the vibe that he was trying to pick me up. Then he started telling me about how he was an ex-Marine, his time in the service, how he stays fit and in shape, and how strong he was. Then, I kid you not, he flexed for me like, "Who are you, Johnny Bravo?" At this point, I was getting annoyed but not creeped out yet. I just wanted to grab my stuff and check out. We reached the lumber section and I started to grab a board. "No, I can grab that," he insisted. "Nah, it's fine, I can do this on my own." He grinned again. "No, ma'am," in a sing-songy voice. Okay, whatever, maybe he needed to feel useful. I let him grab it. He walked behind me to get it, and as he did, he made a weird sound like he just saw something yummy. Immediately, I thought, oh no, it's going to be one of those situations where I have to awkwardly decline some advances. I ignored it. I needed a couple more things, and he insisted on getting them for me. Every time he walked behind me, he would make those disturbing sounds like he thought I was delicious. Right in my ear. Screw the rest of the stuff. I wanted to get out of there. I told him I was going to check out, and he reminded me about the other items I mentioned, saying he could still help me with them. No, I need to be going home, I said firmly. I was definitely not friendly anymore and wasn't smiling. I went to push the cart, and again, in a creepy sing-songy voice, he insisted on doing it for me. We got to the checkout, and at this point I had texted my best friend about him, telling her his name. I can't remember it now. And that if anything happened to me, he was the one who did it. I was only half joking. He was really creeping me out at this point. At the register, one of the boards didn't have a tag on it. Mr. Creep said he'd go grab another. He walked behind me again and whispered, "Delicious," in my ear. I got chills. He came back with the board and walked behind me once more, managing to brush against my hip, even though he had plenty of room. As he did, he whispered, "I could just eat you up. Yum yum." I finally got checked out, but this creep was still hanging around. He offered to help me out to my car. I firmly said no. "Well, I need to take the cart back when you're done. It'll be easier," he said, or something like that. I am not letting him follow me to my car in this huge parking lot. He insisted he had to bring the cart with him. I said I'd just bring my car to the front and load it up. He finally relented and walked back inside. Thank God. I pulled my car to the front. He came out. "Let me load that for you," he said. "No," I responded. I had the board in my arms, and he grabbed it from me with a terrible smile, saying in the creepiest, most seductive whisper possible, No, insert my name. I got this. I can get in there like swimwear." "Yes, ma'am." He gave a massive wink. How the hell does he know my name? My name is very unusual, and no one can guess it. My mom literally made it up. I was so skeeved out and felt incredibly unsafe, even though we were in front of the store and there were people around. He looked at me like I was prey. He finished loading my car and I didn't acknowledge or thank him. He scooted around and opened my car door for me, grinning. I completely ignored him but had to be next to him to get into my car. Right in my ear I heard him whisper, delicious." I gave him the most disgusted look I could muster. This didn't deter him. He licked his lips and winked again. I got into my car and locked the doors. As I put the car in drive, he tapped on my window and waved. I looked at him and I heard him say, "Safe drive back to," insert my apartment complex name. "It was nice getting to know you," insert my name. I pieced out so quick. I've never seen that man before in my life and have no idea how he knew my name or where I lived. I have never gone back to that Lowe's. Every time I think about that incident, I kick myself for not reporting him. A bit of background. I'm 23 now, but I was 20 at the time. I moved in with my uncle in San Antonio, Texas, under the agreement that I wouldn't have to pay rent as long as I helped him with chores and looked after my cousins. I got a job at a well-known coffee chain downtown, near the touristy area. The place had a lot of regulars and some homeless people coming in and out. It was busy enough that I felt safe, and I even used to take walks around the area after work, especially since I was so close to the Riverwalk. A couple of months into the job, I'd become friends with everyone I worked with. We were all really close. On one particular day, it was one of my coworkers' last day. There were 3 guys who had been hanging around the shop all morning. They hadn't bought anything but were just loitering, which wasn't unusual for our location. On my break, I decided to walk down to a nearby drugstore to buy a farewell card and maybe a small gift for my coworker. I walked out and put my earphones in, but before I could press play, I heard the door open behind me and footsteps following. Whoever it was caught up to me and started walking beside me, matching my pace exactly. I turned to look, and it was one of the guys who had been there all morning. He was a bit taller than me and reminded me a lot of Lakeith Stanfield. He asked for my number and I kindly told him no. He persisted, so I snapped and told him to screw off. He stared at me in surprise, probably because I don't look like someone who would speak up or be rude. He stood there as I walked away, and by the time I got back to the coffee shop, the guys were gone. I told my coworkers about the encounter and we laughed it off, thinking that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Every shift after that, he was always there, either hanging out or walking in mid-shift. Sometimes he was with someone else, sometimes alone, but he was always there. I assumed he was just another homeless person considering how often he was around. My shifts were sporadic. Sometimes I opened, sometimes I closed. Sometimes I worked mid, but no matter what, he was always there. I started to feel paranoid. I would catch him staring at me constantly. He never ordered anything and never spoke to me and thankfully never followed me, but he just sat there watching me. I mentioned it to my coworkers and they started noticing it too. One of my team leaders would sometimes help by sending me to the back to wash dishes or organize the cooler. Other coworkers would position themselves in ways to block him from seeing me. I started feeling uncomfortable at work. Some nights when I closed, a coworker would walk me to my car before heading home. Or if I didn't close, they would walk me to my car and then head back inside. Then one day while I was working the register, I noticed him again. This time he walked up and ordered a water. I asked for his name for the order. Now I had his first name just in case. He took the water and went back to his seat. I had mentioned him to my manager before, but since he hadn't done anything overtly wrong, there wasn't much they could do except note it in the manager's book. The next day I was working with my manager and 2 other coworkers and myself. I told them I needed to use the bathroom. There were 2 bathrooms next to each other, sort of hidden from the coffee bar and register, and they weren't gender specific. As I walked around the bar to the lobby area, I had to pass his table. As I did, I noticed him get up. I went into the bathroom, and while I was sitting down, someone rattled the knob. I shouted that it was occupied, but whoever it was just kept rattling the door until I finished. When I opened the door, no one was there. As I walked back to the coffee bar, I noticed him adjusting back into his chair. I was freaked out and immediately told my boss. He couldn't say anything to the guy though, since we had no proof that it was him. Later that shift, the man got up and picked up a coffee from the pickup area. My boss assumed he had ordered it and let him take it. I told him it wasn't his order and that it wasn't even his name. My boss then used this opportunity to tell him that if he did something like that again, he wouldn't be allowed back. The man apologized and, to his credit, followed the rules from that point on, but he still kept coming in, just sitting there watching me. Cut to Valentine's Day. One of my team leaders and I would be scheduled to work certain Thursdays after close to deep clean the store. We would stay until 1 a.m. This was one of those Thursdays. We were almost done and I had to clean the bathrooms as one of the last chores. When I finished and walked out, I saw him peeking in with both his hands pressed to the window, eyes wide, just staring at me with a super intense look. I froze for a second, just staring back. I noticed that on one of his palms, pressed to the window, there was a purple foam heart. He didn't move at all. I freaked out and backed into the bathroom. I shouted, "Hannah, Hannah, he's here, he's back." She barely heard me through the music we had blasting. Hannah, the team lead, would help hide me from him, so she knew the huge fear I had toward him. She walked toward the bathroom, shouting back, "What are you saying? What's going on?" As soon as she got close, she saw him. I told her again, "He's here, he's watching me." She started shouting through the window, "You need to leave. If you don't leave, we're calling the police." I stepped out a little to see if he would leave, but he was ignoring her, his eyes fixated on me. I stepped back into the bathroom and my lead continued to shout at him to leave and threaten to call the police. About 5 minutes passed and he realized I wasn't stepping out until he left, so he did. The next day, my lead and I told my manager I wanted to file a police report. He told me to wait until he talked to his boss. He showed up again that day, but I was only there to talk to my manager and leave right after. When I got home, a friend convinced me to call the cops. I texted my boss saying that I didn't care what he or his boss said. I was scared and going to file the report. I dialed 911 and gave them a summarized version of the events. They told me they would send someone to where I lived to take the official report. The 2 officers were so nice and supportive. I told them my whole story, explaining how my boss didn't think it was necessary to involve the cops since I hadn't been harmed. The officers reassured me that I should have called right away and defended me, saying that they could get him for harassment. I thanked them and they told me to call 911 if he showed up again so they could take him in for trespassing and harassment. I think that day my manager banned him and warned him because he never showed up to the coffee shop again. A few months later, when I felt comfortable downtown again, I went out with some friends to walk around. We were close to where I worked, and as we rounded a corner I saw him. I ducked into a little corner store and my friends followed. I told them I saw him and they kept an eye out. Once he was out of view, we left the store. That was the last time I saw him. So, creepy coffee shop stalker, let's not meet again.